They never knew who was pouring their champagne. Behind the polished marble bar of the Willowbrook Country Club, I adjusted my black vest and smoothed my hair back into the tight bun required by the catering company. The name tag pinned above my heart read Sarah in simple block letters. Not Colonel Sarah Martinez. Not the woman who'd spent the last 15 years commanding artillery units across 3 different continents. Just Sarah, weekend bartender for hire. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, mixing cocktails for people who wouldn't recognize me if I wore my dress blues and every medal I'd ever earned. My own family included. I'd taken this job 3 months ago when I returned stateside, needing something mindless while I figured out what civilian life looked like. The pay was decent, the work was honest, and nobody asked questions about the precise way I folded towels or why I could calculate inventory faster than the computer system. Most importantly, nobody knew my last name was Martinez. The same Martinez family that had been planning this wedding for over a year. The same family that had sent exactly 0 invitations to their eldest daughter. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the ballroom, I watched the grounds crew making final adjustments to the outdoor ceremony space. White roses climbed every pillar, and silk ribbons fluttered in the afternoon breeze like surrender flags. Everything looked perfect, expensive, and completely orchestrated by my mother, Elena Martinez. She'd always been a woman who believed appearances mattered more than truth. Growing up, our house had been a museum of careful presentations. Nothing out of place, nothing real enough to be messy. When I enlisted at 18, she'd told the neighbors I was taking a gap year to find myself. When I made lieutenant, she'd upgraded it to working in government administration. By the time I earned my colonel's eagles, she'd stopped mentioning me altogether. The catering manager, a harried woman named Beth, rushed over with a clipboard pressed against her chest. "Sarah, they want the signature cocktails ready in 20 minutes. The bride specifically requested the lavender martinis be absolutely perfect." "Understood," I replied, already reaching for the bottles of premium vodka lined up like soldiers behind the bar. My hands moved with military precision, measuring each pour exactly. No waste, no mistakes, no room for error. The bride, my sister Jessica. The golden child who'd never met a spotlight she didn't love, or a boundary she couldn't charm her way around. Growing up, she'd been the one who got dance lessons while I got lectures about being too aggressive on the soccer field. She'd been the one who got a car for her 16th birthday while I'd been told that walking built character. She'd been the one whose achievements got framed and hung in the hallway while mine got mentioned in passing, if at all. I hadn't seen Jessica in person for almost 4 years. Not since the disastrous Thanksgiving dinner where she'd announced her engagement to David Thompson, a successful investment banker who made real money, unlike some people who chose unpredictable career paths. She'd made sure to emphasize those words while looking directly at me, still wearing my uniform from the earlier Veterans Day ceremony I'd attended alone. That night, I'd tried to share news of my recent promotion to colonel, the youngest woman in my unit to achieve the rank. Elena had immediately changed the subject to Jessica's wedding plans. When I persisted, trying to explain what the promotion meant, what I'd accomplished to earn it, Jessica had laughed. Actually, I laughed. "Oh, Sarah," she'd said, voice dripping with the condescension she'd perfected in childhood. "Playing soldier is cute and all, but when are you going to get a real job? David makes more in a month than you probably make all year." I'd left that night and hadn't spoken to either of them since. No birthday calls, no holiday cards, no attempts at reconciliation. When they'd needed my new address for wedding invitations, they'd apparently decided I wasn't worth the stamp. But here I was anyway, because life has a twisted sense of humor. I'd found out about the venue purely by accident. Beth had been complaining about a difficult bride during my training week, mentioning details that made my blood run cold. The Martinez wedding at Willowbrook. A bride named Jessica who'd changed the menu 4 times and insisted on specific lighting angles for photos. A mother of the bride who'd requested the staff be appropriately invisible during the ceremony. The smart thing would have been to quit immediately. Find another catering company. Another venue, another way to pay my bills, while I transitioned out of military life. But something had kept me here, some stubborn part of me that refused to run from my own family. Maybe I wanted to see what kind of wedding they'd throw without me. Maybe I was curious about the man Jessica had chosen, this David Thompson, who was apparently worth more than a decorated military career. Or maybe, in some corner of my heart I wasn't ready to examine, I hoped they'd notice me and realize what they'd thrown away. The first guests began arriving as I finished setting up the bar. Country club members in their perfectly pressed khakis and pearl necklaces. Friends from Jessica's sorority days who still looked like they'd stepped out of a catalog. Business associates of the groom who carried themselves with the particular confidence that comes from never having to prove anything to anyone. I recognized some faces from old family photos, distant relatives and family friends who'd known me as a child. None of them looked twice at the bartender arranging glassware with military precision. Why would they? Service workers were supposed to be invisible, and I'd become an expert at blending into the background when it served my purposes. My phone buzzed against my hip. A text from my former commanding officer, General Patricia Hayes. "How's civilian life treating you, Martinez? Pentagon's not the same without your artillery expertise." I smiled despite myself. Patricia was one of the few people who knew where I'd ended up after my discharge. She'd been the one to recommend the transition program that had helped me find temporary work while I figured out my next move. She'd also been the one to warn me that leaving the structure of military life could be harder than any deployment. "Learning to serve drinks instead of justice," I typed back. "Jury's still out on which is more challenging." Her response came immediately. "Both require steady hands and good judgment. You've got this, Colonel." Colonel. Even in retirement, the title felt like armor. Patricia was the only person in my current life who used it, and hearing it always straightened my spine a little. In the military, rank meant something. It represented years of training, countless hours of study, battles fought and won, soldiers led and protected. It was earned through blood, sweat, and an unwavering commitment to something larger than yourself. Here, polishing wine glasses in my sister's wedding venue, I was just another hired hand. The ceremony was set to begin in an hour. Through the windows, I could see the wedding party gathering for photos on the pristine lawn. Jessica looked radiant in a dress that probably cost more than most people's cars, her auburn hair styled in perfect waves that would photograph beautifully. Elena stood beside her, adjusting invisible flaws and directing the photographer with the authority of a field general. I wondered if either of them had thought about me today, if Jessica had felt even a moment's sadness that her sister wasn't standing beside her as a bridesmaid. If Elena had noticed the empty space where a family member should have been seated in the front row. Probably not. They'd written me out of their story so completely that my absence likely felt natural, expected. The difficult daughter who'd chosen a path they couldn't understand or celebrate. The black sheep who'd never learned to be grateful for the life they'd planned for her. A young waiter named Marcus approached the bar, sweat already beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Sarah, they need 2 bottles of the good champagne for the head table, the stuff in the silver ice buckets." I nodded, selecting 2 bottles of crystal from the refrigerated case. My hands didn't shake as I handed them over, though something twisted in my chest. The good champagne for the head table where I'd never sit. The family toast where my name would never be mentioned. As Marcus hurried away with the bottles, I caught a glimpse of movement near the bar's entrance. A man in a perfectly tailored tuxedo was approaching, and something about his bearing made me look twice. Military training had taught me to read people quickly, and this man moved with the controlled grace of someone who'd learned to carry himself with purpose. He was tall, probably mid-30s, with dark hair and serious eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. When he reached the bar, he didn't immediately speak. Instead, he studied my face with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. "Could I get a scotch, neat?" he asked finally. His voice was measured, careful. "Of course," I replied, reaching for the top-shelf bottle. "Any particular preference?" "Surprise me," he said, but his eyes never left my face. There was something familiar about him, though I couldn't place where I might have seen him before. As I poured his drink, I felt his continued scrutiny. It was different from the casual invisibility most guests afforded the service staff. This felt like recognition, though that was impossible. I'd been careful to keep my military service separate from my family's social circles. "Here you are," I said, sliding the glass across the polished wood surface. He picked up the scotch but didn't drink immediately. Instead, he continued studying me with those serious dark eyes. "You know," he said quietly, "I never forget a face, especially not one I've seen in official briefings." My blood turned to ice water. Official briefings, that could mean only one thing. "I think you have me confused with someone else," I said carefully, my voice steady despite the alarm bells ringing in my head. He smiled then, a slow, knowing expression that confirmed my worst fears. "Colonel Sarah Martinez, 3rd Artillery Regiment, distinguished yourself in Operation Desert Shield. Received the Bronze Star for your actions during the Syrian conflict last year." I stopped breathing. This man knew exactly who I was, and he was standing at my sister's wedding bar, reciting my military record like he'd memorized it. "I'm just a bartender," I said quietly, glancing around to make sure no other guests were within earshot. "A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off." "Today, maybe," he replied, taking a sip of his scotch. "But I've read your service jacket, Colonel. What I can't figure out is what you're doing serving drinks at a wedding instead of commanding artillery units." The question hung between us like a live grenade. Who was this man? How did he know about my service record? And more importantly, what was he planning to do with that knowledge? Before I could respond, the wedding coordinator's voice crackled through the staff radio clipped to my belt. "All service staff, positions, please. Ceremony begins in 15 minutes. The man finished his scotch and set the empty glass on the bar. "This has been enlightening," he said. "I'm sure we'll speak again before the evening's over." He turned and walked away, leaving me standing behind the bar with my heart hammering against my ribs. I watched him disappear into the crowd of wedding guests, my mind racing through possibilities. Military intelligence? Pentagon oversight? Someone from my past I'd forgotten? Whatever the answer, my carefully constructed anonymity had just been shattered by a man who knew exactly who I was beneath the catering uniform. And something told me that before this wedding was over, everyone else would know too. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows as I mechanically arranged bottles and checked inventory, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind spun through scenarios. For months I'd been invisible, just another service worker in a world that barely acknowledged my existence. Now, in the space of a 5-minute conversation, that invisibility had been stripped away by a stranger who spoke my rank like a password. I had no idea who he was or why he was here, but one thing was certain: my sister's perfect wedding was about to become a lot more complicated. The memory hit me like shrapnel as I watched the guests filter toward the ceremony space. Afghanistan, 2019, the briefing room at Bagram Air Base, where intelligence officers had presented targeting data to our artillery unit commanders. I'd been the youngest colonel in that room, the only woman, and apparently memorable enough that someone here recognized me 4 years later. But first, I needed to understand how I'd ended up serving drinks at my own sister's wedding instead of sitting in the family section where I belonged. It started with my father's funeral 18 months ago. Captain Miguel Martinez, Marine Corps, 26 years of distinguished service. He died quietly in his sleep, a heart attack that took him so suddenly Elena hadn't even had time to call me before the paramedics arrived. I'd learned about it from his old commanding officer, General Patterson, who'd seen the obituary in the military newsletter. I'd flown back from my posting in Germany immediately, wearing my dress blues and carrying a folded flag to place on his casket. The funeral was scheduled for Tuesday at Arlington National Cemetery, full military honors for a man who'd served his country with unwavering dedication. When I arrived at the funeral home for the family viewing, Elena had taken one look at my uniform and her face had gone white with fury. "Absolutely not," she'd said, her voice cutting through the hushed atmosphere like a blade. "You're not wearing that thing to your father's funeral." "This thing is my dress uniform," I'd replied, keeping my voice respectful despite the anger building in my chest. "Dad would have wanted me to honor his service. Your father would have wanted his funeral to be about him, not about your need for attention," Elena had snapped. "Change into something appropriate, or don't come at all." Jessica, who'd been standing beside our father's casket in a conservative black dress, had turned to face us. "Mom's right, Sarah, this isn't the time for your military theatrics. People are already going to be staring because of the scandal." The scandal. That's what they called my recent Bronze Star commendation. 3 months earlier, my unit had come under heavy fire during a supply convoy escort in Syria. When the lead vehicle hit an IED and 2 soldiers were trapped in the wreckage, I'd made the decision to provide covering artillery fire that allowed the rescue team to extract them safely. Both soldiers had survived with minor injuries. The commendation had made military news outlets. A young female colonel leading a successful rescue operation under enemy fire was exactly the kind of story the Pentagon loved to promote. The coverage had been positive, professional, and focused entirely on the tactical decisions that had saved lives. But somehow, Elena and Jessica had managed to twist it into something shameful. "The neighbors are asking questions," Elena had continued that day at the funeral home. "Mrs. Davidson saw the article online and wanted to know why we never mentioned you were in combat zones." What am I supposed to tell people when they ask why my daughter is running around playing soldier in war zones? Playing soldier. The phrase had landed like a physical blow. 22 years of service, multiple deployments, countless hours of training and leadership, reduced to a child's game in my mother's estimation. "I'm not playing anything," I'd said, my voice barely controlled. "I'm serving my country. Dad understood that, even if you don't." "Your father indulged your phase," Elena had replied coldly. "He thought you'd grow out of it and settle down like a normal woman. Instead, you've made a career out of embarrassing this family." That's when Jessica had delivered the killing blow. "David's company does business with several defense contractors," she'd said, not meeting my eyes. "His reputation could be affected if people think our family is connected to controversial military operations. Some of his clients have concerns about the current political climate around overseas interventions." I stared at my sister, trying to process what she was saying. "You want me to hide my service record because it might hurt your fiancé's business deals?" "I want you to consider how your choices affect other people," Jessica had shot back. "For once in your life, think about someone besides yourself." The argument had escalated from there. Elena had threatened to ban me from the funeral entirely if I didn't change clothes. Jessica had accused me of being selfish and attention-seeking. I had pointed out that Dad had been proud of my military career, that he'd kept every commendation letter I'd ever received, that he'd called me after the Syria operation to tell me how proud he was. "He was proud because he didn't understand what you actually do," Elena had said, her voice dripping with disdain. "All that violence, all that destruction. It's not natural for a woman to choose that kind of life. Your father was too polite to say it, but we all know the truth." "What truth?" I demanded. "That you joined the military because you couldn't handle real life, because you needed someone else to tell you what to do and how to do it, because you were too afraid to build something meaningful on your own." The words had cut deeper than any enemy fire I'd faced overseas. This was my mother, the woman who'd raised me, reducing my entire career to a character flaw, suggesting that my choice to serve was somehow evidence of weakness rather than strength. I'd left the funeral home that day and checked into a hotel near the cemetery. I'd attended Dad's funeral alone, standing at the back of the gathering in my dress blues, watching as they lowered his casket into the ground with full military honors. The Marine Honor Guard had presented Elena with the folded flag, and she'd accepted it with appropriate dignity for the cameras. But when the ceremony ended and people began offering condolences to the family, Elena walked past me as if I didn't exist. Jessica had followed her lead, accepting sympathy from relatives and family friends, while I stood invisible in my uniform. That had been our last conversation until today. After the funeral, I'd thrown myself into my work with renewed intensity. I'd requested additional deployment rotations, taking on assignments that kept me overseas and away from the painful reality of my family's rejection. When my commanding officers had suggested I consider transitioning to civilian life, to spend more time with family, I'd deflected and requested another overseas posting. But the military had other plans. Budget cuts and force restructuring had led to early retirement packages for mid-level officers. Despite my exemplary service record, I'd been encouraged to accept the package and transition out at full pension. At 36, I was suddenly a civilian for the first time since I was 18 years old. The transition had been brutal. Military life provided structure, purpose, clear chains of command, and measurable objectives. Civilian life was chaos by comparison. Job interviews where employers couldn't understand how artillery command translated to corporate leadership. Apartment hunting, where landlords were suspicious of someone with no recent rental history. Simple tasks like grocery shopping in stores that didn't operate on military schedules. I'd started working for the catering company because it was an immediate income that didn't require extensive background checks or lengthy interview processes. The work was straightforward, the uniform was provided, and nobody expected me to explain my life story. It was supposed to be temporary, just until I figured out what came next. But weeks had turned into months, and I'd found myself oddly comfortable in the invisibility the job provided. After years of command responsibility, there was something peaceful about work that ended when the event was over. No life-or-death decisions, no personnel evaluations, no strategic planning sessions that stretched into the early morning hours. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd gone from commanding artillery units to serving champagne to people who wouldn't recognize my name if it was printed in gold letters. But it had felt like a necessary pause, a chance to figure out who Sarah Martinez was when she wasn't Colonel Martinez. I'd been managing that identity transition reasonably well until 3 months ago, when Beth had mentioned the Martinez wedding and everything had clicked into place. My sister's perfect day at one of the most exclusive venues in the area, with a guest list that probably included half the social and business elite of the region. The smart choice would have been to request a different assignment, to avoid the emotional minefield of working my own family's wedding. But something had kept me from making that call. Maybe it was curiosity about what kind of celebration they'd plan without me. Maybe it was a masochistic desire to see how completely they'd erased me from their narrative. Or maybe, in some part of my heart I wasn't ready to acknowledge, I'd hoped that seeing me would remind them that I was still their daughter and sister, still someone worth including in their lives. Now, as I watched guests finding their seats for the ceremony, I realized how naive that hope had been. Elena and Jessica had moved on without me so completely that they didn't even recognize the bartender serving their wedding reception. I was exactly as invisible as I'd tried to become. Except for one man who knew exactly who I was beneath the catering uniform. A stranger who'd somehow recognized me from military briefings and seemed far too interested in my presence here. As the string quartet began playing the processional music, I realized that my carefully maintained anonymity was about to be shattered. Whatever happened next, my sister's perfect wedding was about to become a lot more complicated than anyone had planned. The ceremony was beginning, and somewhere in that crowd of perfectly dressed guests, a man who knew my real identity was waiting to see what I would do next. The ceremony had begun, and I found myself trapped behind the bar with nothing but my racing thoughts and the distant sound of wedding vows drifting through the open doors. The other staff members had been dismissed to prepare the reception space, leaving me alone with an entire arsenal of premium liquor and a decision that could change everything. I could finish my shift quietly, collect my pay, and disappear back into the anonymous life I'd built. The mystery man who'd recognized me might approach again, but I could deflect, deny, and maintain the carefully constructed wall between my past and present. Elena and Jessica would never know their disgraced daughter had served drinks at the social event of their year. Or I could stop hiding. My phone buzzed against my hip. Another text from General Hayes. Saw the news about the Martinez wedding in the society pages. Quite the coincidence you're in the same area. Hope you're staying out of trouble, Colonel. I stared at the message, wondering if Patricia somehow knew exactly where I was and what I was doing. She'd always had an uncanny ability to read situations before they exploded. During my last deployment, she'd pulled me aside 3 days before a major operation and asked if I was mentally prepared for what was coming. I'd assured her I was fine, completely focused, ready for anything. The operation had gone sideways within the first hour. Intelligence had been wrong about enemy positions, our support units had been delayed by mechanical failures, and I'd found myself making split-second decisions that saved my unit, but violated direct orders from higher command. Patricia had backed my choices when the review board questioned them later, but she'd known somehow that the mission would test me in ways I wasn't expecting. Now, standing in this marble and crystal ballroom wearing a catering uniform, I felt that same sensation of standing on the edge of something that would demand more from me than I was prepared to give. The wedding march crescendoed through the speakers, followed by applause and the rustle of 200 guests rising to their feet. Jessica had officially become Mrs. David Thompson, joining her life to a man who apparently knew enough about my military service to make my family nervous about political implications. I'd never met David Thompson, but I'd done my research after Jessica's engagement announcement. Harvard MBA, managing partner at an investment firm that specialized in defense and technology acquisitions. His company had been involved in several high-profile government contracts over the past 5 years, including some that had crossed my desk during interagency briefings. It was entirely possible that David Thompson had been in some of those same Pentagon meetings where the mystery man had seen my face. The defense contracting world was smaller than most people realized, especially at the executive level where major decisions were made. If David's business involved classified military contracts, he would have had security clearances, access to briefings, knowledge of key personnel. The thought made my stomach clench. Had Jessica's fiancé known who I was this entire time? Had my sister married a man who was aware of my service record while she dismissed it as playing soldier? The possibility added another layer of betrayal to an already complicated situation. Footsteps echoed across the marble floor as the first wave of cocktail hour guests began filtering into the reception space. I quickly checked my appearance in the mirror behind the bar, smoothing my hair and adjusting my name tag. Sarah the bartender was back on duty, even if Colonel Martinez was stirring restlessly beneath the surface. The first guests to approach were a group of middle-aged women in coordinated pastels. Their conversation focused on the ceremony's elegant details and the bride's stunning dress. I mixed their wine spritzers and cosmopolitans with mechanical precision, my hands moving automatically while my mind remained elsewhere. "Excuse me, miss?" An older gentleman with silver hair and a slight military bearing had approached the bar. Something about his posture triggered my recognition protocols, and I found myself automatically straightening my spine in response. "Yes, sir? What can I get for you?" "Bourbon. Neat, if you have something decent." His eyes swept over my face with the same intensity I'd noticed from the earlier mystery guest. "You look familiar. Have we met before?" My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression neutral. "I don't think so, sir. I'd remember." He accepted the bourbon I poured but continued studying me with uncomfortable focus. "I'm retired Air Force. Spent most of my career in joint operations coordination. You remind me of someone I worked with in, must have been 2018 or 2019, interagency briefings at the Pentagon." The glass I was polishing slipped slightly in my grip. 2018 had been a busy year for joint operations, multiple agencies coordinating responses to emerging threats in 3 different theaters. I'd briefed Air Force leadership on artillery support capabilities for at least 6 different operations that year. "I think you might have me confused with someone else," I said carefully. "I've never worked at the Pentagon." He took a sip of bourbon, still watching me with those sharp eyes. "Maybe so, but the resemblance is remarkable. That woman was impressive. Colonel, if I remember correctly. Youngest officer in the room, but she commanded respect from everyone present. Even the generals paid attention when she spoke." The compliment hit harder than I expected. During my military career, I'd grown accustomed to being the youngest person in important meetings, the only woman in rooms full of men who'd served twice as long as I had. But I'd earned my place at those tables through competence, preparation, and an absolute refusal to be intimidated by rank or experience. "She sounds like someone worth remembering," I said quietly. Indeed she was. The gentleman finished his bourbon and set the glass on the bar. "If you happen to remember who she reminds you of, tell Colonel Martinez that General Morrison sends his regards. She'll know what that means." He walked away before I could respond, leaving me frozen behind the bar with my heart hammering against my ribs. General Morrison. I remembered him clearly now. Air Force Strategic Command, a man who'd championed several of my operational recommendations despite resistance from more conservative voices in the Pentagon hierarchy. 2 recognition incidents in one day couldn't be coincidental. Either the defense establishment had inexplicably converged on my sister's wedding, or my presence here was about to become much more complicated than I'd anticipated. The next hour passed in a blur of cocktail orders and increasingly pointed conversations. A woman from the State Department mentioned how much I resembled someone from an interagency task force. A Navy contractor asked if I'd ever worked in military logistics. A congressional aide seemed convinced we'd met at a Capitol Hill briefing. Each interaction felt like a small detonation, gradually revealing the scope of my exposure. These weren't random coincidences. The guest list for Jessica's wedding apparently included a significant portion of the Washington defense and foreign policy establishment, people who'd worked with or alongside military leadership during my most visible years of service. By the time the reception dinner was announced, I'd counted at least 7 people who'd shown signs of recognizing me. None had been as direct as Morrison or the original mystery man, but the pattern was clear. My carefully maintained anonymity was dissolving like sugar in water. Beth appeared at my elbow with her ever-present clipboard. "Sarah, we need you to help serve dinner. 2 of the waitstaff called in sick, and we're short-handed. Can you handle wine service for tables 12 through 18? Wine service meant moving through the dining room, approaching each table directly, making extended contact with guests who'd already shown signs of recognizing me. It was exactly the kind of exposure I'd been trying to avoid all evening. "Of course," I heard myself saying. "Whatever you need." As I loaded wine bottles onto a service cart, my phone buzzed with another message. This time it wasn't from General Hayes. The number was local, unfamiliar. "Colonel Martinez, we need to talk before the evening goes any further. Meet me by the garden entrance in 10 minutes. Come alone. DT. DT. David Thompson." The groom wanted to meet privately with the bartender he'd never officially met, using a rank that shouldn't exist in his civilian world. I stared at the message, feeling the ground shift beneath my feet. This wasn't random recognition anymore. This was orchestrated, intentional, purposeful. My sister's new husband had not only known exactly who I was, he'd been planning this conversation since before the ceremony began. The question was whether this was an ambush or an opportunity. I could ignore the message, finish serving wine, collect my pay, and disappear. I could maintain the fiction that Sarah the bartender had nothing to do with Colonel Martinez, that this was all an elaborate misunderstanding. I could preserve the anonymous life I'd built and avoid whatever confrontation David Thompson had planned. Or I could finally stop running from who I was. I grabbed a bottle of the good champagne from the service cart and headed toward the garden entrance. After 18 months of hiding, it was time to find out what my sister's new husband wanted with the family member they'd erased from their lives. The garden was lit with fairy lights and the soft glow of paper lanterns, creating an atmosphere of romantic elegance that felt surreal given the circumstances. David Thompson stood near a marble fountain, still wearing his perfectly tailored tuxedo, but looking less like a celebrating groom than a man preparing for a difficult negotiation. When he saw me approaching, he straightened with a bearing that confirmed my suspicions about his military connections. This wasn't just a successful businessman who'd happened to encounter my service record. This was someone who understood exactly what my rank and experience represented. "Colonel Martinez," he said quietly as I approached, "thank you for coming." "It's just Sarah," I replied, though my voice carried none of the deference I'd been using with guests all evening. "And you have exactly 5 minutes to explain how you know who I am and what you want." He smiled slightly, and for the first time since I'd arrived at this wedding, I saw something resembling respect in someone's eyes. "Fair enough," he said. "But first, I think you should know that your sister has no idea you're here tonight." David Thompson's words hung in the garden air like smoke from an explosion. Jessica didn't know I was here, which meant the evening's growing complications were about to get exponentially worse. "Explain," I said, setting the champagne bottle on the fountain's marble edge. My voice had shifted without conscious thought, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to demanding answers from subordinates. David noticed the change immediately. His posture straightened in response, and I caught the flash of something that looked almost like relief in his eyes. 3 months ago, my firm was contracted to conduct background security reviews for a new Pentagon initiative. Your name came up in the files as a potential candidate for a consulting position. "I'm retired," I said flatly. "Officially, yes." But your expertise in joint artillery operations and interagency coordination is exactly what they need for this project. He paused, studying my face. When I saw your surname in the files and cross-referenced it with Jessica's family information, I realized we had a problem. A problem. He was talking about my existence like it was a logistical complication to be managed. Your wife never mentioned having a sister in the military? David's laugh was bitter. Jessica mentioned having a sister who'd made some unfortunate life choices and wasn't part of the family anymore. According to her, you'd joined the military to avoid real responsibility and had been causing embarrassment and drama for years. She said you were unstable, attention-seeking, and that the family had made the difficult decision to maintain distance for everyone's well-being. Each word hit like artillery fire, precise and devastating. This was how Jessica had described me to her fiancé. Not as a decorated officer who'd served with distinction, but as a family embarrassment who'd been rightfully cut off. The narrative was so completely inverted from reality that I almost laughed. And you believed her? I had no reason not to until I saw your actual service record. David ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, disturbing the wedding photographer's careful work. Colonel Sarah Martinez, Bronze Star recipient, youngest woman to command an artillery unit in active combat operations. Commendations from 3 different theater commanders. A service jacket that reads like a textbook example of exemplary military leadership. So you decided to investigate your wife's family without telling her? I decided to understand what kind of people I was marrying into, he corrected. Jessica's version of events didn't match the documented evidence. Either the military had completely fabricated your record for some inexplicable reason, or my fiancé had been lying about her own sister for years. The implications settled between us like fallout. David Thompson had discovered that his bride-to-be was capable of sustained, detailed deception about something as fundamental as her own family relationships. He'd learned that the woman he was planning to marry could craft elaborate false narratives and maintain them convincingly enough to fool someone with his level of security clearance and investigative resources. What did you do with that information? I asked. Nothing, initially. I convinced myself that family dynamics are complicated, that maybe there were details I didn't understand. But then I started paying closer attention to how Jessica talked about other people, other relationships. The pattern became concerning. Concerning how? David was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on the fountain's gently flowing water. She has a gift for rewriting history to suit her needs. Conversations that didn't happen the way she remembers them. Friends who've wronged her in ways that seem disproportionate to their actual actions. A version of events where she's always the victim and never the problem. And yet you married her anyway. I married her because I hoped I was wrong about what I was seeing. Because I wanted to believe that the woman I fell in love with was real, not just another carefully constructed narrative. He looked at me directly then, and I saw something broken in his expression. I realized about halfway through the ceremony today that I'd made a terrible mistake. Before I could respond, the sound of high heels clicking on marble announced someone's approach. We both turned to see Elena Martinez walking toward us with the determined stride of a woman on a mission. She was still wearing her mother-of-the-bride outfit, a sophisticated champagne-colored dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "David, sweetheart, people are asking where you've gone," she called out as she approached. Then she noticed me standing beside him and her steps faltered slightly. For a moment, confusion flickered across her face as she tried to place the familiar features beneath my catering uniform. "I was just getting some air," David replied smoothly. "The bartender was kind enough to bring champagne." Elena's eyes narrowed as she studied my face more carefully. I watched the exact moment recognition dawned, her expression shifting from polite social interest to something approaching horror. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Working," I replied simply. "Working." Elena repeated the word like it tasted poisonous. "You're working as hired help at your own sister's wedding?" "I'm working as hired help because I need the income and they need the staff. The family connection is purely coincidental." Elena's face went through several color changes as she processed this information. I could see her calculating the implications, the potential for embarrassment, the risk that someone might recognize me and ask awkward questions about why the bride's sister was serving drinks instead of sitting with the family. "This is unacceptable," she said finally. "You need to leave immediately." "Actually," David interjected, "she doesn't. Sarah is here as a professional doing her job. There's no reason for her to leave." Elena turned on him with the full force of her maternal authority. "David, you don't understand the situation. Sarah has a history of creating scenes and disrupting important family events. Having her here in any capacity is a risk we can't afford." "What kind of scenes?" David asked, his voice carefully neutral. "She wore her military uniform to her father's funeral," Elena said, as if this explained everything. "Made the entire service about her, instead of honoring Miguel's memory. She has this need to be the center of attention, to make everything about her military career and her supposed achievements." I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. Elena was doing it again, rewriting history to cast me as the villain and herself as the victim. In her version of events, honoring my father's service by wearing my dress uniform had been attention-seeking behavior rather than appropriate military protocol. "I wore my uniform because Dad was proud of my service," I said quietly, "because he earned the right to have his daughter honor him in the uniform he taught her to respect." "Your father was embarrassed by your choices," Elena snapped. "He was too polite to say it directly, but he never understood why you chose violence over family, why you prioritized strangers over the people who loved you." "That's not true. Isn't it? When was the last time you called? When was the last time you visited without some crisis or drama bringing you home? You've spent 20 years choosing everyone else over your own family, and now you show up here to work our wedding like some kind of twisted punishment." The accusation hit its target with precision. It was true that I'd rarely initiated contact with Elena or Jessica over the past few years. It was true that most of my visits home had been driven by necessity rather than desire. But Elena was conveniently omitting the reasons why: the constant criticism, the dismissal of my career, the clear message that my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. "Maybe I stopped calling because every conversation became a lecture about how I was disappointing you," I replied. "Maybe I stopped visiting because I got tired of being treated like a failure for choosing to serve my country." "You chose to serve your ego," Elena shot back. "All that violence, all that destruction, all those years spent learning how to kill people efficiently. That's not service, Sarah, that's pathology." The words landed like physical blows. Elena had just reduced 22 years of military service, countless lives saved through strategic coordination, years of protecting American interests overseas, to a psychological disorder. In front of my sister's new husband, who worked in defense contracting and understood exactly what my record represented. David's jaw had tightened during Elena's tirade, and I could see him reassessing everything he thought he knew about Jessica's family dynamics. This wasn't a complicated family situation with valid concerns on both sides. This was systematic emotional abuse disguised as maternal concern. "Mrs. Martinez," David said carefully, "I think there might be some misunderstanding about Sarah's military service. Her record indicates—" "I don't care what her record indicates," Elena interrupted. "I care about protecting my daughter's wedding from unnecessary drama. Sarah has a pattern of making everything about herself, and I won't allow her to ruin Jessica's special day." As if summoned by her mother's words, Jessica herself appeared at the garden entrance. She was radiant in her wedding dress, practically glowing with happiness and champagne. Her smile faltered when she saw our little gathering, and her eyes moved from David to Elena to me with growing confusion. "What's going on?" she asked, approaching with careful steps that suggested her designer heels weren't meant for garden walkways. "People are looking for you, David. They want to do the toast soon." "Jessica," Elena said quickly, "your sister is here." Jessica's gaze swung to me, and I watched her face go through the same recognition process Elena had experienced. Confusion, realization, and then something that looked almost like panic. "Sarah, why are you—" She looked me up and down, taking in the catering uniform, the name tag, the champagne bottle I'd been carrying. "Are you working here?" "Yes," I said simply. "She just told me she's been working as hired help for months. Elena added, her voice dripping with disapproval. Apparently, this is what her military training prepared her for. Jessica stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her mind working through the implications. Her decorated military sister, the family embarrassment she'd told her new husband about, was standing in her wedding reception venue, wearing a server's uniform and carrying champagne. "This is perfect," Jessica said finally, and there was something sharp and delighted in her voice. "This is absolutely perfect." The tone made my stomach clench. I recognized that particular note in Jessica's voice from childhood, the sound she made when she'd discovered something she could use against me. Whatever was about to happen, it wasn't going to be good. "Jessica," David said quietly, "maybe we should discuss this privately." "No," Jessica replied, her smile growing wider and more dangerous. "I think everyone should know exactly what my big sister has been up to. In fact, I think this calls for a special announcement during the toasts." Elena's face went pale. "Jessica, sweetie, maybe that's not." "Oh, but it is," Jessica interrupted, her voice rising with excitement. "Everyone's been asking about my family, wondering why I don't have any sisters in the wedding party. Well, now they can meet my sister, the one who chose to serve drinks at my wedding instead of being part of my family. She was going to humiliate me publicly, in front of 200 guests who included a significant portion of the Washington defense establishment. People who knew my actual record, who understood what my service meant, who would witness Jessica's version of events and draw their own conclusions about our family dynamics. "Don't do this," I said quietly. "Do what?" Jessica asked innocently. "Acknowledge my sister? Introduce her to my guests? Share how proud I am that she's found meaningful work in the service industry?" David stepped forward. "Jessica, I don't think—" "You don't think what?" Jessica turned on him with sudden fury. "That I be honest about my family? That I should pretend my sister isn't here working as hired help because she couldn't figure out how to have a real career?" The garden had gone completely silent except for the fountain's gentle bubbling. 3 conversations were happening simultaneously. Elena desperately trying to prevent a scene, David realizing what kind of family he'd married into, and Jessica preparing to weaponize my presence for maximum damage. "Come on," Jessica said, grabbing my arm with surprising strength. "It's time for the toasts anyway. And I have so much to share with my guests about my wonderful, accomplished sister." As she dragged me toward the reception hall, I caught David's expression. He looked like a man watching a disaster unfold in slow motion, powerless to stop it but unable to look away. The humiliation was about to be public, deliberate, and devastating, and there was nothing I could do to stop it without making everything infinitely worse. The ballroom fell silent as Jessica clicked her champagne flute with a butter knife, the crystal chime cutting through conversations like a blade. 200 guests turned their attention to the head table where she stood radiant in her wedding dress, one hand resting possessively on my shoulder. I stood beside her in my catering uniform, trapped like a specimen under glass. The irony wasn't lost on me that after years of commanding rooms full of military leadership, I was now completely powerless in a ballroom full of people who didn't know who I really was. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jessica began, her voice carrying that practiced sweetness she'd perfected since childhood, "I want to thank you all for being here to celebrate this perfect day with David and me. But before we continue with the traditional toasts, I have a very special surprise." Elena was frantically gesturing from her seat at the family table, making subtle cutting motions across her throat. David stood frozen beside Jessica, his face a mask of controlled horror as he realized what was about to happen. "You see," Jessica continued, tightening her grip on my shoulder, "everyone's been asking why I don't have any sisters in my wedding party. Well, the truth is, I do have a sister, and she's actually here tonight." A murmur rippled through the crowd as guests craned their necks to see who Jessica was referring to. Several people in the defense contractor section were already frowning, recognition dawning on their faces. "I'd like you all to meet Sarah," Jessica announced with theatrical flourish, "my big sister, who chose to work this event tonight instead of sitting with the family. She's been serving your drinks all evening as part of the catering staff." The reaction was immediate and uncomfortable. Nervous laughter mixed with shocked whispers. as people tried to process what they were hearing. A few guests looked genuinely confused, while others seemed embarrassed to be witnessing such obvious family dysfunction. "Now I know what you're thinking," Jessica continued, her voice rising with false enthusiasm. "Why would someone choose to work their own sister's wedding instead of celebrating with family? Well, that's just Sarah for you. She's always been unconventional in her choices." General Morrison, the retired Air Force officer who'd recognized me earlier, was staring at Jessica with undisguised disgust. Colonel Richards from the Pentagon Acquisition Office looked like he'd accidentally swallowed something unpleasant. The entire defense establishment section of the reception was radiating waves of secondhand embarrassment. "You see, Sarah joined the military right out of high school," Jessica went on, her tone becoming more condescending with each word. "She thought playing soldier would be more exciting than getting a real education or building a meaningful career. And while the rest of us were growing up, getting married, starting families, contributing to society in normal ways, Sarah was off. Well, doing whatever it is she does overseas." David's hand moved toward the microphone, but Jessica stepped smoothly out of his reach. "But the best part," Jessica said, her smile growing wider and more vicious, "is that after all those years of pretending to be important, she's finally found work that actually suits her skill set. Serving drinks. Because really, what else is she qualified to do? Mix cocktails and follow orders?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wedding band had stopped playing, their instruments hanging uselessly in their hands as they watched the social catastrophe unfolding on stage. That's when David Thompson stepped forward. He moved with the deliberate precision of someone who'd been trained in crisis management, reaching the microphone before Jessica could react. His face was pale but determined, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the ballroom with absolute clarity. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, gently but firmly taking the microphone from Jessica's hand, "I need to correct some misinformation that's just been shared." Jessica's smile faltered. "David, what are you?" "The woman standing here," David continued, his voice growing stronger, "is not just Sarah the bartender. She is Colonel Sarah Martinez, United States Army, retired. Bronze Star recipient, the youngest woman ever to command an artillery unit in active combat operations." The ballroom erupted, not in applause, but in the kind of shocked exclamations that follow a revelation that changes everything. General Morrison shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. Colonel Richards dropped his champagne flute, the crystal shattering against the ground. "Colonel Martinez," David continued, his voice cutting through the chaos, "served with distinction in 3 different theaters of operation. She coordinated joint artillery support that saved hundreds of American lives. She received commendations from Pentagon leadership for tactical innovations that are now taught at West Point." Jessica had gone completely white, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly as she tried to process what was happening. Elena looked like she might faint, one hand pressed against her chest as if she couldn't breathe. "The woman my wife just described as playing soldier," David said, and there was steel in his voice now, "is one of the most decorated officers of her generation. She didn't choose to work this event because she lacks qualifications. She chose to work this event because she's been systematically excluded from her own family for having the courage to serve her country." The defense establishment section of the reception had become a tableau of military discipline snapping into action. General Morrison was already moving toward the head table, his face set in lines of grim determination. Colonel Richards was right behind him, along with 3 other officers I recognized from various Pentagon briefings. "Furthermore," David continued, and his voice was shaking now with barely controlled anger, "I want everyone in this room to understand that Colonel Martinez has been deliberately misrepresented by her own family. The woman who just mocked her service has spent years spreading false information about her sister's record and character." Jessica finally found her voice. "David, stop. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," he interrupted. "I understand that I married someone who could look at a Bronze Star recipient and see only embarrassment, Someone who could take a decorated war hero and reduce her to hired help in front of 200 guests. General Morrison had reached the stage now, his bearing rigid with military protocol. He stepped up onto the platform and, without hesitation, snapped to attention and delivered a perfect military salute. "Colonel Martinez," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom, "it is an honor to see you again, ma'am." The effect was electric. Every military member in the room, active duty, reserve, and retired, rose to their feet in unison. The sound of chairs scraping back was like thunder, followed by the sharp crack of multiple salutes being executed simultaneously. Colonel Richards saluted. Captain Harrison from Naval Intelligence saluted. The Pentagon Acquisition Team saluted. Even the young Marine security contractor near the back of the room snapped to attention and rendered honors. Jessica looked around the ballroom in growing horror as she realized that a significant portion of her wedding guests were now standing at attention, saluting the sister she'd just humiliated as hired help. "What? What is this?" she whispered. "This," David said quietly, "is respect. Something your sister earned through 22 years of distinguished service, and something you just threw away in front of everyone who matters in the defense community." I stood frozen in the center of it all, still wearing my catering uniform, still holding the champagne bottle I'd been carrying when Jessica dragged me on stage. But something fundamental had shifted in the room's dynamic. The invisible bartender had become the most important person in the ballroom. Elena had sunk into her chair, her face buried in her hands. Jessica was staring at the sea of saluting military officers like she couldn't process what she was seeing. The civilian guests looked back and forth between the military contingent and the family drama, trying to understand how the evening had gone so completely off the rails. General Morrison held his salute until I returned it, muscle memory taking over despite the surreal circumstances. Only then did the room begin to relax, though the tension was still thick enough to cut with a knife. "Colonel Martinez," Morrison said formally, "on behalf of the United States Armed Forces, thank you for your service. And on behalf of every person in this room who understands what that service means, I apologize for what you've had to endure tonight." The applause started slowly from the military section, then spread outward as civilian guests began to understand what they'd just witnessed. It wasn't polite wedding applause. It was the kind of sustained, respectful recognition reserved for genuine heroes. Jessica's perfect wedding had just become Colonel Sarah Martinez's vindication, and there was no going back from what had been revealed in that ballroom. The ballroom had transformed into something resembling a diplomatic crisis zone. Small clusters of guests huddled in intense conversations, their voices a low hum of shock and speculation. The military contingent had formed an impromptu honor guard around me, while the social elite who'd come expecting a typical high society wedding looked like they'd stumbled into a war zone. Jessica stood at the head table looking like a porcelain doll that had been dropped and hastily glued back together. Her perfect makeup couldn't hide the growing red blotches on her neck, and her hands shook as she reached for her champagne glass only to find it empty. "This is insane," she said, her voice cracking. "David, you've completely ruined our wedding. Everyone's staring at us like you're exactly what you are," David replied coldly. "A woman who just humiliated a war hero in front of the defense establishment because you couldn't handle being upstaged by your own sister's genuine achievements." Elena had rallied enough to approach the head table, her face a mask of barely controlled panic. "We need to fix this," she hissed. "Sarah, you need to explain to these people that this is all a misunderstanding. Tell them you were just having some fun with your sister." I looked at my mother, really looked at her, and saw something I'd never noticed before. Not embarrassment or anger, but genuine terror that her carefully constructed social world was crumbling in real time. "No," I said quietly. "I'm done protecting your feelings at the expense of my dignity." "You can't be serious," Elena snapped. "After everything we've given you, all the sacrifices we made." "What sacrifices?" The question came from General Morrison, who'd remained on the stage like a sentinel. "Mrs. Martinez, I've read your daughter's service record. She's saved more American lives than most officers see in their entire careers. What sacrifices did you make compared to that?" Elena's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. She'd built her entire narrative around the idea that my military service was selfish, that I'd abandoned my family for personal gratification. But faced with someone who understood exactly what my service had cost and accomplished, her story dissolved into meaningless noise. "You don't understand the situation," Elena tried again. "Sarah has always been difficult, always needed to be the center of attention. We tried to support her, but she made choices that—" "Ma'am, with respect," Colonel Richards interjected, stepping forward with his dress uniform medals catching the ballroom lights. "Your daughter was awarded the Bronze Star for coordinating artillery fire that extracted 12 wounded soldiers from an active combat zone. She spent 18 hours under enemy fire to ensure their safe evacuation. That's not attention-seeking behavior, that's heroism." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Heroism. It was a term that carried weight in military circles, not used lightly or for political purposes. When Colonel Richards called me a hero in front of this crowd, he was making an official statement about my character and service. Jessica finally exploded. "This is ridiculous. She's my sister, not some war hero you're all obsessed with. Sarah, tell them. Tell them about the fights we had. About how you never called. About how you chose strangers over your own family." "I chose service over selfishness," I replied, my voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "I chose protecting Americans over protecting your ego. And I chose to honor Dad's memory by wearing the uniform he was proud of, even when you told me it was embarrassing." "Dad was embarrassed by you," Jessica screamed, her composure finally shattering completely. "He used to tell Mom he wished you'd just settle down and stop trying to prove you were tough. He never understood why you had to be so masculine and aggressive all the time." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the catering staff had stopped moving, frozen by the raw viciousness of Jessica's words. David was staring at his new wife like he'd never seen her before. "Jessica," he said slowly, "your father's obituary specifically mentioned his pride in his daughter's military service. I read it when I was researching your family." That was just... Jessica faltered, realizing she'd been caught in another lie. "Another rewrite of history?" David finished. "Like everything else you've told me about your family?" Elena stepped between them, her maternal instincts kicking in despite the circumstances. "David, you're upset. People say things they don't mean during emotional moments. Jessica loves you, and she loves her sister, even if she has trouble expressing it." "No," I said firmly. "She doesn't love me, and I'm finally okay with that." The words felt like shedding armor I'd been carrying for years. All the guilt, all the hope that somehow things would change, all the desperate desire for family acceptance, it fell away like dead weight. "I spent 22 years serving my country with honor," I continued, addressing not just Jessica and Elena, but the entire ballroom. "I saved lives, I protected American interests, I earned every rank and every commendation through blood and sacrifice. And I did it all while carrying the knowledge that my own family saw it as shame rather than service." General Morrison nodded approvingly. "Colonel Martinez, the Pentagon has extended an offer for you to consult on the new Joint Artillery Coordination Initiative. I hope you'll consider it." "I will," I replied, feeling something inside me straighten and strengthen. It would be an honor to continue serving, even in a civilian capacity. Jessica made a sound like a wounded animal. The attention, the respect, the opportunities. Everything she'd thought she was denying me by excluding me from the family was being offered freely by people who actually understood my worth. David removed his wedding ring and placed it on the head table with careful precision. "I can't be married to someone who would treat a war hero this way, especially when that hero is their own family member." The gasps from the wedding guests were audible this time. Elena grabbed his arm. "David, please, don't make any hasty decisions. This is just a family drama, it doesn't have to affect your marriage." "Mrs. Martinez," David said gently but firmly, "I work in defense contracting. My reputation depends on my ability to recognize character and integrity. I can't be associated with someone who lacks both." 6 months later, I stood in the Pentagon briefing room where my new career had begun. The consulting position had evolved into something much larger, a permanent advisory role, developing artillery coordination protocols that would save lives in future conflicts. My office overlooked the Potomac River, and my desk was covered with strategic assessments that actually mattered. The work was challenging, intellectually stimulating, and connected to a mission I believed in. For the first time since leaving active duty, I felt like myself again. The divorce had been finalized within 3 months. David had been generous in the settlement, but Jessica had lost more than money. The video of her wedding meltdown had gone viral in defense circles, effectively ending any possibility of her husband's business connections providing social advantages. The very establishment she'd tried to impress had witnessed her cruelty and found it wanting. Elena had attempted reconciliation exactly once, appearing at my new apartment with a casserole and a prepared speech about family forgiveness. I'd listened politely, thanked her for the food, and explained that forgiveness didn't require me to subject myself to further abuse. She'd left looking older than her years, finally understanding that actions have consequences, even within families. My phone buzzed with a text from General Hayes. Saw the promotion announcement in Defense News. Colonel Martinez to Senior Strategic Advisor, your father would be proud. She was right. Dad would have been proud, not of the rank or the title, but of the fact that I'd finally stopped trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it and started building a life worthy of the service he'd taught me to value. The knock on my office door interrupted my thoughts. Come in. David Thompson entered, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him since that disastrous wedding. His new consulting firm was thriving, built on the foundation of integrity that had led him to walk away from a profitable but toxic marriage. Colonel Martinez, he said with a slight smile, ready for the Joint Chiefs briefing? Ready, I replied, gathering my files. As we walked through the Pentagon corridors, I reflected on the strange turns that had brought me here. A wedding that was supposed to be my sister's perfect day had become the catalyst for my own redemption. The family that had tried to erase me had inadvertently revealed my true value to the people who mattered most. You know, David said as we approached the briefing room, I never thanked you properly. For what? For showing me who Jessica really was before it was too late to escape with my integrity intact. I considered this. You showed yourself who she was. I just refused to keep hiding who I was. The briefing room was filled with the kind of military leadership I'd always respected, people who understood that service meant sacrifice, that honor was earned through action, that character was revealed under pressure. As I took my seat at the conference table, I felt the weight of belonging that had been missing from my life for too long. My nameplate read, Dr. Sarah Martinez, Senior Strategic Advisor. I'd completed my doctorate in strategic studies during the transition period, another achievement my family would have found threatening but my colleagues celebrated. The presentation I was about to give would influence artillery deployment strategies for the next decade. The recommendations I'd developed would protect soldiers I'd never meet in conflicts I couldn't predict. It was exactly the kind of meaningful work I'd always been meant to do. As the briefing began, I thought about Jessica's wedding toast, her assertion that my military training had only prepared me to, quote, mix cocktails and follow orders. She'd been spectacularly wrong on both counts. My training had prepared me to lead, to innovate, to protect, and to contribute to something larger than myself. The bartender uniform was long gone, donated to charity along with the painful chapter of my life it represented. In its place, I wore the confidence of someone who'd finally stopped apologizing for being exactly who she was meant to be. The family that had once called me their greatest shame would now see my name in defense publications, quoted in strategic assessments, referenced in military academies where future officers studied the protocols I'd developed. History would remember my service, even if they never would. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.